You're listening to the Everything Jewish 10 Minutes at a Time podcast, where you'll learn about every Jewish topic imaginable in about 10 minutes. Quick disclaimer, I'm still an AI voice, so my Hebrew pronunciations might sound like autocorrect on a bad day. Close, but hilariously wrong. So if you hear me say something and think, that can't be right, you're probably correct. Today's topic is the Sadducees. Nope, not a punk band from the 80s. Not the latest Marvel villain squad, though, admit it, the Sadducees would make a killer name for a dark rock group. Instead, they were one of the most important Jewish groups around the time of the Second Temple. To set the scene, imagine the first century as a Netflix series. You've got Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes, and Zealots, basically rival factions all arguing about how to live Jewishly under Roman occupation. The Sadducees were the aristocratic, temple-centered group who cared a lot about priestly power, sacrifices, and keeping things old school. Their influence was huge, and understanding them helps explain how Judaism shifted after the temple was destroyed. The Sadducees get their name either from Zadok, a priest in King Solomon's time, or just from the Hebrew root, meaning righteous. Either way, their branding screams, "We're the real deal." Think of them like the blue-check verified users of Second Temple Judaism, except instead of Twitter clout, they had actual control over the temple, the Sanhedrin, that's the high Jewish court, and the priesthood. If Judaism at the time had political parties, the Sadducees would be the well-connected, upper-class, pro-establishment group. They weren't handing out free loaves and fishes, wrong religion for that, but they were heavily invested in ritual sacrifices and maintaining a close relationship with the Romans. Why? Because if you're in charge of the temple, the economic, religious, and political center of Jewish life, you want things to run smoothly. Less mess, more control. In short, they represented wealth, power, and status. The Pharisees, their rivals, had the street cred with the common people, but the Sadducees had the keys to the temple treasury. Now, here's the real theological drama. The Sadducees only accepted the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, as binding law. That's it. Genesis through Deuteronomy. Forget the oral tradition, forget rabbinic interpretations, and definitely forget later prophetic writings. To them, if it wasn't written down in Moses' law, it didn't count. This put them directly at odds with the Pharisees, right, who championed the oral Torah and built the framework that would eventually become Rabbinic Judaism. So if the Torah said, do not work on Shabbat, the Sadducees took it very literally. No 25 categories of forbidden work, no debates about carrying tissues in an eruv. It was the text, plain and simple. Imagine arguing with someone who refuses to recognize any Supreme Court rulings after the Constitution was written. They'd be like, show me where in the original document it says that. That was the Sadducees' whole vibe. Ultra-literalists, but only when it suited them. One of the most famous Sadducee-Pharisee debates was about the afterlife. The Pharisees believed in resurrection of the dead and the existence of angels and spirits. The Sadducees, total skeptics. No resurrection, no angels, no divine afterlife courtroom. You live, you die, and that's the end. Like a Netflix show canceled after 1 season with no warning. The New Testament even highlights this rivalry, with Sadducees mocking Pharisees about resurrection. Their view might sound bleak, but it fit their theology. Since they only accepted the Torah, and the Torah never explicitly says resurrection of the dead, they weren't buying it. This also conveniently made sense for a group invested in the here and now of temple ritual and political power. Why focus on heaven when you've got front row seats in the earthly temple? To the Sadducees, holiness was about sacrifices, priestly roles, and law, not spiritual after-parties. So what was day-to-day life like for a Sadducee? Picture them as the polished elites of Jerusalem. They were priests or wealthy landowners, rubbing elbows with Roman governors, wearing fine clothes, and running the temple complex like a Fortune 500 company. The temple wasn't just a religious center. It was an economic hub. Pilgrims came from all over to sacrifice animals, buy offerings, and pay the temple tax. Who oversaw this whole system? The Sadducees. Think of them as part clergy, part Wall Street execs, part political lobbyists. It was a delicate balance. Keep Rome happy, keep the people somewhat content, and keep the sacrifices flowing. They weren't loved by the masses. Most ordinary Jews preferred the Pharisees, who were closer to the people, but they were powerful. And like any ruling class, their critics accused them of being more interested in maintaining privilege than in true piety. Of course, the Sadducees' world came crashing down in the year 70 CE when the Romans destroyed the Second Temple. This was catastrophic for everyone, but especially for the Sadducees. Their whole identity revolved around temple sacrifices, priestly rituals, and controlling that sacred space. Once the temple was gone, they lost their platform, their income, and their influence. All at once. The Pharisees, with their emphasis on Torah study, oral law, and synagogues, were able to adapt and eventually became the foundation for rabbinic Judaism. The Sadducees? They basically disappeared from history, leaving only scattered mentions in Jewish and non-Jewish sources. It's like when Blockbuster shut down. Except imagine if Netflix and Hulu weren't there to take its place. The Sadducees didn't pivot to Sadducees Online streaming sacrifices. They vanished. Even though they disappeared, their legacy lives on in debates about literalism, elitism, and religious authority. Some scholars compare them to modern religious fundamentalists who reject interpretive traditions and stick only to scripture. Others see them as a cautionary tale. If your whole religious system depends on one building or one political structure, what happens when that structure collapses? Meanwhile, the Pharisees' adaptability made them the spiritual ancestors of mainstream Judaism. In a weird way, the Sadducees' defeat paved the way for the Judaism we know today. Without them, though, we'd miss an important piece of the puzzle. They were the foil that sharpened Pharisaic arguments, and their clashes helped clarify Jewish theology on resurrection, angels, and the oral law. Pop culture time. If the Pharisees are like the Jedi, guardians of tradition and wisdom for the people, the Sadducees are kind of like the Galactic Senate, elite, political, keeping order, but maybe a little out of touch. They had the clout, but not the popular support. Or think of sports. The Pharisees were like scrappy underdogs who played for the crowd, while the Sadducees were the wealthy team owners sitting in box seats, sipping wine, deciding what happened on the field. Their disappearance wasn't just a tragedy, it was an inflection point. Without the temple, their playbook was useless. But for that century or two, they mattered a lot. You couldn't understand Jewish politics, law, or Roman-Jewish relations without factoring in the Sadducees. So what's the takeaway? The Sadducees teach us about fragility, adaptation, and perspective. They remind us that religious life can't survive on political power alone. It needs flexibility, community roots, and ideas that can thrive beyond buildings. They also show us that debates within Judaism have always been fierce, passionate, and complex. Pharisees versus Sadducees wasn't just a theological spat. It was a struggle for the soul of Judaism. Spoiler, the Pharisees won by surviving, but the Sadducees helped shape the arguments along the way. If nothing else, their story is a reminder. Don't put all your eggs in one temple. Or to modernize it, don't build your entire brand on MySpace. Because once the platform goes, so do you. Thanks for listening to this episode of Everything Jewish, 10 minutes at a time. If you enjoyed learning about the Sadducees, share this podcast with a friend, a family member, or that person in your life who always insists on reading the instructions literally. And hey, if you've got a moment, leave us a review. It really helps more people discover the show. Until next time, remember, Jewish history is full of fascinating groups, debates, and characters, and every one of them, even the ones who disappeared, still has something to teach us today.